Welcome and thank you to those of you joining us today for the CMTUK online Q&A session on the subject of CMT, Charcot-Marie tooth disease, also known as hereditary motor and sensory neuropathy. CMT is a hereditary medical condition that damages the peripheral nerves, meaning that the muscles become progressively weaker over time. This session is part of the CMT Awareness Month, where we reach out and let people know about CMT and CMT UK, increasing the knowledge and understanding of CMT amongst the medical profession, the general public, and those undiagnosed but living with the condition. My name is Simon Bull. I'm Chief Executive of CMT UK, the only UK charity dedicated to supporting people living with and affected by Charcot-Marie tooth disease. And I am absolutely delighted to be joined by Professor Mary Reilly, who is one, if not the leading authority on CMT in the UK. Mary is Professor of Neurology at UCL Queen Square, the Institute of Neurology, and she's also the patron of CMT UK. Mary will be answering questions asked by members of CMT UK and the CMT community. So welcome, Mary, and thank you for giving us your time today.
Thank you. Good to be here.
I have some questions here, but before we jump into those, can I start by asking you, well, a couple of things really, if it's okay. Firstly, a very brief, what is CMT, if you would be so kind, and also with so much research going on in the world, how much hope do you have that things will or perhaps are already getting better for CMT sufferers?
So CMT, as you said, stands for Charcot-Marie tooth disease, which were three guys in 1886 that described the condition. And it is known as hereditary motor and sensory neuropathy. And I know one of the questions today are about that. And it is true that hereditary motor and sensory neuropathy is easier to understand, but people find the word CMT easier to say. So around the world, people use CMT because it's easier to say. But it is a neuropathy, which has damaged the nerves in the arms and legs. It is motor and sensory. And if your motor nerves are damaged, you get wasting of muscles with weakness. And if your sensory nerves are damaged, you get lack of sensation and numbness and damage to the skin if you can't feel properly. And hereditary means it is due to an abnormal gene. So hereditary motor and sensory neuropathy is the same as Charcot-Marie tooth disease. Now, there's been rapid advances in all genetic diseases over the last, particularly decade, a couple of decades, I would say, maybe the last 30 years diagnostically, and in the last 10 years therapeutically. And I would say that there is definite hope of treatments. So in other diseases that are genetic, hereditary neuropathies like TTR amyloid, which is a more serious disease in that people die of it within a few years if they don't get the disease. If they have heart involvement, it's 3 to 5 years, it can be longer. We now have gene therapies licensed, and everyone that is eligible is on gene therapy since 2019. So in CMT, there are gene therapies and various other therapies, either in trial or in preclinical trials for most of the common forms of CMT. I would say there is a high chance of therapies being available for some forms within a decade, if not sooner. But I think it's important to state that most treatments being developed are to prevent deterioration. It's very difficult for any cause of neuropathy to reverse the damage if it's long-standing. If someone gets a very acute neuropathy, you can reverse the damage, so it's long-standing. So that means in the future, if we have therapies like we have for this other condition, it changes the whole field in that you have to make the diagnosis much earlier because you want to get people treated before therapy. So I think we're on the cusp of change in the way we think about CMT, and in the way the medical profession will be under pressure to make a diagnosis earlier. Because I know one of the frustrations for many patients is that they come up with a medical profession that says, yes, we can look into it, but there's no treatment. And in a way, it's not urgent. And I think perhaps during COVID, people particularly felt that some of these chronic diseases, it was tough having them because understandably more urgent things took preference. So I think things will change. So I think it is a very hopeful time.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so let's get into the questions that we've received from the community. I'll start with Sarah McNally, who's asking, why does CMT make her feel so tired?
So that's an excellent question, Sarah, and it's a question we don't know the full answer to. First of all, there's no question that some people with CMT suffer from fatigue. Not everyone, but some. And we do see fatigue as a consequence of the muscle weakness. So, you know, if you're completely healthy muscle-wise and you get up and walk 10 meters or 100 meters or a mile, you will have a normal fatigue at the end of it. And if you are starting off with weaker muscles, you will fatigue more. So that's unquestionably one of the causes of fatigue. It is due to the weakness. But there's a second kind of fatigue that people with CMT sometimes suffer, which is a more general fatigue. And we don't quite understand it, and it's probably multifactorial. In some patients, there can, particularly with a slightly more severe CMT, they can suffer from sleep apnea. So they don't sleep that well at night, and that can impair their sleep and impair their performance during the day. In other people, sometimes we know from studies we've done, led by Geeta Ramadari here and others, that because people are not as mobile with CMT, they don't exercise as much, that generally the amount of steps they take per day is less. And on average, they have a higher BMI rate that is slightly more overweight than the average population. That doesn't mean everyone is, but on average, and a little more unfit. So cardiovascular fitness is probably less, and that can give to fatigue. And then at other times, there are simply other causes of the fatigue which need to be looked into separately. So it's often multifactorial. We don't quite understand why many patients with inherited neuromuscular diseases, not just CMT, have it. But my feeling is the predominant cause is the underlying problem that your muscles, so you have a lot of muscle. If you think of your body, there's a huge amount of muscle in your body. And if a lot of those muscles, particularly distally, are not normal, it means everything you do takes that much more effort. And it may be you don't notice that little bit more effort in lifting your hand to get down something from a cupboard, but that accumulates fatigue.
Okay, thank you. That's a few things there for Sarah to consider. I've got a question here, which I think I've kind of already asked you, and you've already answered in a way. This comes from a parent whose son is 9 years old, and they're going through the process of confirming his CMT diagnosis. He's still very young, and they're asking what's on the horizon for CMT treatments or therapies. What might he see as he grows up?
Yeah, so I think it's, I addressed it briefly, but I think it's a very important question. So I think the first thing is, I think it's important that CMT is not untreatable right now. So particularly if he's 9. So at the moment, he's about in the next few years to enter puberty and a growth spurt. So those are critical years for patients with CMT in terms of having the right foot support, the right therapy support, and the right exercises, etc. Because your body is growing, and it depends on how tall you're going to be, but it can grow a foot or more in a very few years. So those kind of simple measures, which are often quite difficult to access, are critically important, particularly the right therapy and orthosis as are needed during that period of time. But you're right, he is 9, and I've just said earlier that I expect changes within a decade. So we are expecting changes. So my prediction would be that there'll be 2 things likely to happen. There may be therapies that what I call our pathogenesis therapy. So if you have an abnormal gene, let's say the PMP22 duplication CMT1A, and we know that having 3 copies of that gene, of that protein, causes a disease. A huge amount of work in the last 20 years has been to see, can we reduce the amount of that protein present in nerves? And that's called a pathogenetic therapy. It looks at what causes the disease, and that's the word pathogenesis, and sees how you can treat it. Now, that's not been we haven't been very good at that in genetic diseases generally. People have put hundreds of millions of pounds into pathogenesis and not always got an answer. But there are drugs in trial and in development that definitely reduce the expression of PMP22, and I would expect it is likely one of those will be used in practice to at least slow the disease within the next 10 years. What I think is more likely to happen is gene therapies. Now, I could not have envisaged this when I was a medical student, that you can go into a cell and change the gene. And you can do this in 4 ways. Number 1, is antisense therapy, and number 2 is silencing RNA. So these are therapies that are given by subcutaneous injection or by intravenous, that's a drip. They're certainly at the moment not given by tablets. That might change. And in some diseases like spinal muscular atrophy, they're given by a lumbar puncture. So these are therapies that go in and they can change various things about the gene. They can silence the gene that is faulty, or they can change the expression of another gene. And they are in use in SMA, Duchenne's, TTR amyloidosis, and certainly successfully in preclinical models for CMT1A. So that's, I think, very exciting. And it takes a bit longer for CMT because people generally have a normal lifespan. So you're not allowed to do clinical trials with something until it's incredibly safe, quite rightly. The third kind of gene therapy, which is really the new kid on the block, is called CRISPR-Cas9. So this is a way of actually going in and editing the gene, so changing the abnormality at the genetic level, not just silencing the abnormal gene, but correcting it. And this was given to the first patients this year of any disease at all. And it was, again, TTR amyloidosis. So it's been used in preclinical models, but it's never been used in a live patient. So the very first patients this year were injected with this therapy. And if it does work, it will permanently correct the problem. You'll never need any other therapy. Now, these patients that were given it, the abnormality in these patients with TTR amyloid is in the liver cells. So it's easy to direct a gene therapy. Well, easy is the wrong word, but you're only having to aim it to the liver. For a nerve disease, you have to aim it to the nerve. But that is something which I think we're at the beginning of seeing happening. So being able to go in and edit a gene as a one-off injection, that's it for life. Now, that would be unbelievable if it came in. And then the fourth thing, for certain forms of CMT, like X-linked CMT, due to the JGB1 mutation, we know there's the disease is caused by a loss of function of the protein. We know that the genetic problem causes the protein not to work. So there are other therapies where a gene is called viral directed gene therapy. So the gene is actually encapsulated, that is put in an inactive virus and given to the patient to replace it. And again, this is being used in patients with spinal muscular atrophy and being trialed in CMTX1 and CMT4C in preclinical models. Now, many of you 2 years ago would never have heard of this, but if you've heard of vaccines for COVID, so it's very similar to some of the vaccines where the vaccine is given in an inactive virus that is able to get into the cell. So that's how you can give some sort of gene therapy. So there's 4 kinds of gene therapies. And I think that, if your son is 9, the chances of some of these being used routinely for CMT by the time in a decade and a half time are very high. There's just safety stuff to go through first. And the attractive thing about the genetic therapies is they're developed for all genetic diseases, not just neuropathy. So technology-wise, if a revolution is made in heart disease or in gastrointestinal disease, we can use it in CMT. So it's very attractive because it's kind of technology that crosses boundaries. So even though your particular son may have a individual mutation in a individual gene, the kind of technology is being developed will allow it to be customized and personalized much easier than anything we do now. So I think it's an incredibly hopeful time, but I'm very careful with the timing in years. Years ago, I would have been even more careful, but now, having seen it come through with many diseases, we would be hopeful that we'll be doing trials within a decade of these gene therapies in CMT.
That's quite amazing, really, isn't it? It's quite hopeful.
Well, it is amazing. I mean, it is absolutely incredible. I mean, I know it's always tough on patients when they're hearing this and we're saying, but it's decades or it's years away. But it's something we never knew we could even do. So to me, it's a level of hope that was never there before. So if I had to predict the future, really, really predict it, like in decades to come, I would say, like people are talking about in Duchenne's and spinal muscular atrophy, if we have incredible treatments that just need one injection, that means these patients then will get tested at birth. It will become normal to test at birth for a condition that you can treat at birth and prevent it becoming a condition. So, the truth would be what we'd like to do is have therapies that were given as soon as a disease was diagnosed and prevent the disease. And that actually will be birth or in the first year of life. Now, that we're not there yet, but we are talking about it in other diseases. And at the moment, you all know, if you have a baby, there are certain things they check at birth because they know they can treat and do stuff immediately. We already do that for other diseases, but not these kind of ones. So that is something that's rapidly changing. The number of diseases that are now getting screened at birth is increasing all of the time. And they increase if we have a treatment that, given early, prevents problems. And CMT would certainly qualify for that if we did have such treatments.
Okay. The next question I have is a little more immediate. And it's, my feet are rolling outwards. What shoes do you recommend?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I can address a number of the questions people have put in today about their feet, about walking, about shoes, about orthosis. And other people have put in multiple questions about knee surgery, hip surgery, etc. to do with CMT. Now, it is impossible for me to comment individually on these because you can't comment on someone you haven't seen. There are many ways your feet can roll, and therefore some shoes is be suitable for one person and other shoes suitable for another person. So it's impossible to say. What you're aiming for with your feet is to have your feet stable as possible so you don't fall and trip. Now, for some people, that will be a normal shoe with an insole, and that the insole is designed by a podiatrist or an orthotist so that it deals with what's making you roll out and corrects that. With other people, it will mean proper orthosis, like ankle foot orthosis. And there's, as you all know, many different kinds of stents that are suitable. There's ones that are suitable if you've just a little weakness, bringing up your foot, that is foot drop. But if you have more weakness that you also tend to turn out on your ankle, you need a different kind of orthosis. And sometimes people need one for when they're outside and another one when they're inside. So all of that is very important. Then people ask about hip surgery and knee surgery. CMT is not a contraindication to having surgery if you need it. So just because you have CMT does not mean you cannot have surgery. But it is really important the surgeon knows you have CMT, because their normal policies of getting you up on your feet in a day and getting physiotherapy, doing this, that, and the other, may need to be modified to allow for the fact that you may have weakness around your knee, for instance, the top of the leg and the bottom. But all of this can be got around, because if you have a joint that's very painful and that needs surgery, it may still need surgery just because you have CMT. It doesn't mean you can't, it just needs to be individualized. So I would say the answer to all of these questions, and it's always a difficult answer to give, is it's an individual question. You need to find a good physiotherapist who's interested in your condition, followed by a good orthotist who knows about insoles, or podiatrist or chiropodist, or sometimes it's them first and then the physio. So someone who understands CMT, aims at you walking stably, because that will protect your knees and hips and back. Because if you're walking badly, that creates problems with your knees, hips, and back. And if you do need surgery, it's making sure your surgeon is a surgeon that knows about CMT, and that they realize with the therapy afterwards that that's taken into account. So I know it's a very generic answer, but I'm afraid it is generic because it does depend on the individual patient, what the problems are. I would say with most forms of CMT, the classical weakness is foot drop, because you cannot pull your ankles up, but also turning your feet out because you're weak with the legs, the feet going out, and strong with them coming in. So turning over in your feet is very common because of the imbalance of the muscles. And often surgery, when it's done on children in their teenage years, is all about getting tendon transfers, etc., all about getting balance back so that you walk with a balance. I mean, surgeons will always use the word to get balance back. So I hope that gives in a flavor, but it is an individual, in which shoes it depends on, it depends on the problem.
Yeah. Okay. And another question from the same person is about literature to help children understand what CMT is and how it affects them.
Yes, no, that's a very good question. I was asking Simon, when I had seen that question, what's available through CMTUK with that, because I know there's a very strong children's group through CMTUK. And Simon, you were going to look into what literature is available, because you do have stuff on your website, etc.
We got some on the website, the same but different age groups. I'll have to review that and see.
Yeah. And what we do as well, I mean, that's a very good question, because I see adults over the age of 16, but I will look into what's available for children and let Simon know, so it can be linked to the website.
Yeah.
Because I think that is an important one. And I know there is stuff available from other groups, but I think if it isn't available through CMTUK, we need to make sure it is available.
Yes, and I am aware that there is somebody's currently writing a storybook for children that will hopefully help them with some of this. So we'll look out for that coming soon. I have a request here from Sarah that can you please come to Ireland and give a lecture on CMT to student doctors?
Of course I'll come if I'm asked. You know, that's a slightly tongue-in-cheek comment. Of course, student doctors should be taught about CMT. I don't know what happens in Ireland at the moment. I've often given lectures to more senior people. That would be, you know, doctors who are qualified but are subspecialising. I would say, though, it depends on where in Ireland you are. There are good people everywhere, really, and I would recommend particularly a doctor called Sinead Murphy. Sinead Murphy is a consultant neurologist in Tala in Dublin, and Sinead trained with me and has set up, you know, a very, very good CMT clinic in Ireland. So I would say, although I'm very happy to, it also is good to have a local name that might be. So I would say, you know, Sinead Murphy is the person to give lectures in Ireland at CMT. She's an excellent neurologist.
Okay. Thank you. I think
the Newcastle question, isn't it?
It's a bit too.
Yeah, well, maybe I can address it though, because there's a couple of queries, if that's okay. So a number of this has come through this forum, but also a number of other people have asked. So in Newcastle, of course, which is a huge part of, you know, the north part of the country, Newcastle is a very big neuroscience centre for a major part of the northeast and indeed the northwest, and it's a very strong neuromuscular unit there. But Rita Hobart was the clinician there that saw most patients with CMT, and Rita 2 or 3 years ago moved to Cambridge and is no longer there. And a number of people have asked what's happening in Newcastle, and I actually looked into that this weekend so that I would make sure I was saying the right answer. So first of all, as you probably realize, during COVID, there's been, you know, complete almost a moratorium on any developments. So nobody has been appointed to any of these posts. But the plan is to have an adult person with an interest in CMT in Newcastle again, and that isn't in place at the moment. The children are definitely able to be seen in Newcastle, and Professor Volker Straub is the head of the inherited neuromuscular group in Newcastle, and he reassured me the children can be seen there. Now, I know there's an excellent consultant neurologist called James Miller in Newcastle who does do peripheral neuropathy, and he does both CMT and many inflammatory neuropathies. And I know that at the moment he sees all the patients with CMT in Newcastle. Now, I know him personally, and he's really good. So I would say if anybody in Newcastle wants to see somebody about CMT, they should be asked to be referred to James Miller, who is an adult neurologist with an interest in neuropathy, which includes CMT. And there will be somebody else appointed in due course, because I appreciate the comment that Newcastle is a very long way for someone to have to come to any other clinics. But that is my recommendation at the moment in Newcastle.
Right. Okay. And now we have the question from David Edmiston regarding HMSN.
Yes. And I mean, I did mention that at the beginning. I mean, I agree, but it's not going to happen, because in real life, if you say HMSN, it doesn't come out as easily as CMT. And CMT, in a way, it's an odd thing to say, but it's actually got a presence. People, when you say CMT or you type in CMT, you know, it's now internationally, people know what it is. And actually, that's really powerful too. To change it to make it more accurate probably isn't in the best interest of the group at the moment, because more and more people recognize the word CMT. I know a lot of you will say you go to your GPs, you go to people, they don't. But compared to 10 years ago, the word CMT, a lot of people recognize it. So I would say, even though it's more accurate to call it HMSN, I think CMT has taken on a life of its own, which is probably a good life in terms of it giving visibility to the disease.
It's certainly far more international CMT,
yes.
Isn't it?
Absolutely.
A question here from Peter, who was diagnosed in 1989, but he doesn't know what type. Are there statistical surveys done on a routine basis for the success rate of knee joint replacements performed on CMT?
That's a very good question, Peter, and I did in a way address it at the beginning. It's very individual. So the answer is no. So I think that, you know, and I think one of the problems is it does depend on the type of CMT, the outcome of surgery. So what we've been doing in the last 5 years here, we've set up what's called a prospective study. So every person that has needed surgery, we see them before and after to try to begin to develop an understanding of how people with CMT do with all of these surgeries, be it ankle, knee, hip, back. But to my knowledge, there hasn't been a very good survey of the outcome of that yet. And actually, it is a very good point, because actually, you know, Simon, even with CMTUK, it wouldn't be a difficult thing to do a survey and say, how many people with CMT have had knee replacements or hip replacements, and what's the outcome? The Survey Monkey. Yeah. I think it would be something that maybe CMTUK could take on board, just to get a feeling, because we know the statistics, they'll be available to the NHS for the normal population, meaning normal, don't have CMT, what the outcome is. Because I think it's a very important, because patients often really want to know whether they should have it or not. So I think that's a very good suggestion for CMTUK to take on board, actually, and could be doable fairly easily.
Yes, absolutely. That wouldn't take too much. And of course, things are improving as time goes by, but it would be useful to know how people have got on in the past. Now, the next question. Well, I just flip back to Peter. He says he was diagnosed in '89, but too late to know of what type. Could he find out if he was minded?
No, absolutely. I mean, that's a very important point. In '89, you're absolutely right, Peter. In '89, it's not that you were too late, you were too early. No genes were known in '89. The first gene was described in 1991, and now there's about 120 genes. But in real life, it depends on whether you have type 1 or type 2. So with people coming to my clinic in 2021, so if somebody walks through the door, there's a 77% chance we will find the causative gene. So we know 77% of the genes, but we don't know 23. Now that's much better than it was, but it's not 100%. We discover new genes every year. So the chances are, if you came to clinic, there's a 77% chance we'd find the gene. So we know it for most of them. Now we're much better with CMT1. We have about a 95% success rate in CMT1 and about a 50% in CMT2. So it's not quite the same. We're just not as good as one or the other. So just because it was too late to know what type, then if you wanted to know, at the moment, it doesn't make a specific difference, except if we know what type it is, we know more about the disease, then I can predict what will happen to people a bit more. We certainly, 1989 would not put me off at all. I have patients come into clinic where we find the diagnosis after 20, 30, 40 years they've been coming to clinic, and they've given up, we'll ever find it, and we do. And it is fantastic to be able to tell people you found it after multiple years of people coming to clinic.
Yeah, that's what I thought. An interesting question here from James, who is 68. He was diagnosed last year with CMT type 2. There's no history of CMT in his family, and going forward, his sons and grandsons don't appear to have inherited the condition. So he's asked, his consultant is satisfied that there's an abnormal gene. He's obviously relieved that he hasn't passed it on, but given that CMT is normally referred to as, or is the conversation we've just been having about hereditary motor and sensory neuropathy, how fortunate is he to be dealt a recessive gene?
So I think that's a complex question. Again, I'm, saying immediately, I don't know your particular circumstances, so I can only give a very generic answer. But I think it brings up an important point, which I can answer about. So first of all, we're not as good at making the diagnosis of CMT2. So the fact that you had genetic testing done and it was negative, that's the same for about 50% of people. So we had a big hit last year. There's a new gene we have found, which is turning out to account for about 10% of all autosomal recessive CMT2. You wouldn't have had that done because it's not available yet in the panels in the UK, but it's about to be brought in. So there is a new gene that could well be the answer, but not definitely. So the first thing is, when you're correct, if somebody has CMT, if their parents didn't have it, if their brothers and sisters don't have it like you, and if their children and grandchildren don't have it, it makes it more likely to be autosomal recessive. And autosomal recessive is where you have to have 2 copies of the abnormal gene to the disease. So each one of us have 20,000 genes. We've 1 copy of the 20,000 from our mum and 1 copy of the 20,000 from our dad. And in an autosomal recessive condition, you have to have 2 abnormal copies. So if you've got 2 abnormal copies, your children will all inherit 1 of the abnormal copies from you and a normal copy of the same gene from your partner. So they'll be carriers, but not have the gene. Now, if someone comes to my clinic, even in your situation, I would be slow to say it's 100% definitely autosomal recessive unless I know the gene, because it would depend on a few things. You're 68, you're only diagnosed last year, so I don't know the age of onset. But in people that the age of onset is slightly older, it can be that your sons are not old enough to have got the symptoms. So if everyone in the family gets it by age 10 and your sons are 30s, then it's very unlikely they have the condition. But if everyone in the family gets it at 20, 30, 40, and your sons are 30, it may be impossible to say they don't have it. Because in a family like yours, sometimes an individual person, it's not recessive, it's what's called de novo dominant. That means you only need one abnormal copy of the gene to have the disease, but it starts in you, because every genetic condition has to start in a family somewhere. So if it started in you, your brothers wouldn't have it, your parents wouldn't have it, but your children could still be a 50-50 chance of having it. So that would only apply if you had, if you've had it all your life and your children are normal, it's likely to be recessive. But if you got it late and your children are of an age that's younger than when you got it, it may still be de novo dominant. Does that make sense? So it is slightly complex in terms of it. And, how common is recessive? Well, in this country, to have a recessive form of CMT, it's about 20 to 30%, so it's much rarer than the dominant types. But each one of us sitting around here carry 4 or 5 recessive genes, but we happen not to have children with another one. We all carry them, 4 or 5 different ones for different diseases. So the commonest recessive disease in the UK is cystic fibrosis. The commonest recessive neurological disease is Friedreich's ataxia. So in cystic fibrosis, 1 in 25 of us approximately carry an abnormal gene, but you don't tend to have children who carry the same abnormal gene. So it is statistically, it can happen with people. Clearly, if you have children with someone related to you, you're more likely to have similar genes. That's why in countries where there's a high rate of first cousin marriages, we do see more recessive disease, because people tend to have children together who have are more likely to have the same sets of genes. Does that make sense? So I think from looking at what you've written, I think your consultant sounded like they were right, is likely to be recessive. I don't have the information from you to know exactly the ages, but I'm just putting for other people out there that it depends a little bit on the age of onset in your family, how definite it is that you have recessive versus de novo dominant. And I have become more cautious in clinic until I know the gene is saying that, because we've seen people be told they had recessive and it turns out it wasn't recessive years later. Does that make sense? Simon, I'm not sure that's a complex question.
It does, yes. Thank you for that. That's interesting. The next question is from Lynn Tasker, who's asking, do you see gene editing as a future treatment for CMT1A? How would it work and how long before you could see such a treatment?
So as I said, gene editing people, there's a lot of words used, but the gene editing at the moment, people mean this CRISPR-Cas9 that goes in and turns off or on a gene. And I think that is something that's just gone into humans for the first time for a disease this summer. So I don't see it being available for CMT1A in the very short term, but much more likely, there are 2 groups of people working on an antisense and a silencing RNA. That is a way of, if you have CMT1A, you've got 3 copies. You have 1.5 times the amount of peripheral myelin protein 22. And both of these in preclinical models switch down the production to 100%. So in other words, to the normal amount. I think I'd be very surprised if there wasn't a clinical trial of one or the other of these within the next 5 years. I think we're at that stage. It's the safety issues. It's not that they're particularly unsafe, but people with CMT1A have a normal lifespan, so they have to be 100% safe. So these are the ones that are in use for other diseases, and they're very safe. The problem with them is at the moment, they all have to be given either intravenously into the spine, that's through a lumbar puncture, or subcutaneously with injections regularly. So you have to have them repeatedly. So that's the disadvantage of them. And they're not cheap, to be fair. None of them are cheap. The ones that are, they're very, very expensive treatments. So I think that would be probably taken into consideration as well in disease that people feel it doesn't limit lifespan. So I think, it may be, the nice thing about the proper gene editing is if it was a one-off injection, that would be very, very attractive. I think that'll take a bit longer. I would have thought more likely 5 to 10 years before gene editing would be in a clinical trial. That doesn't mean it wouldn't be tried in in preclinical models, so in cells, etc., with a clinical trial.
Okay, that's something to look for, to follow. The next question from John Berridge is, given that CMT causes muscle atrophy, is it safe to contemplate hip-knee replacements? Perchance it is not possible to regain the associated muscle strength.
Yes, that's really what I said about earlier. They're not contraindicated. You can have them, but it depends on your individual circumstances and the surgeon and the physiotherapist knowing that they have to work harder on it. If somebody can walk with CMT and they then cannot walk because of terrible pain in their hip or their knee, they may need an operation. You're right, you think a bit more carefully about it, but of course you can have it, but it just needs the right backup with it in terms of therapy.
And to make sure that the people you're working with are aware of your...
Absolutely, it needs to be done by people who know about CMT.
Yeah,
absolutely, really important.
And what is your advice on the optimal exercise modality and intensity for people with CMT? Can you over-exercise?
Yeah, so two very important questions. And one, I obviously can't answer individually what's the best exercise, because it totally depends on the individual people. I have people come into the clinic that do all kinds of exercise, as you can imagine. So exercise is good for two reasons. Number one, aerobic exercise is very important to keep fit generally for all of us. And number two, exercises for, the limbs that are weak and the limbs that are not weak, for keeping the good muscles as good as they can be, and for keeping the less good muscles as good as they can be, and keeping the joints mobilized so that they're supple. So it depends very much. I'd say most people, and I know there will be some people, running is not, unless you're very mild CMT, running is quite tough on the feet. I mean, running is quite tough on people's feet in the long term anyways, or treadmill. So often it's not running, but it does vary. I'm not saying nobody with CMT can run. Often people find bicycling, especially in exercise bike, very helpful because they're not weight bearing. People like that very much. And often people find swimming. Now, swimming is a great exercise for CMT because all of your joints are supported by water. But of course, it's access to swimming, which is very difficult for CMT. A lot of pools don't have appropriate access, or they've got the access, but then you have to walk over a wet surface to get to the pool in the first place. So it's more access to swimming. So swimming in the UK is not brilliantly supported, I think, for CMT, but it does vary. And the intensity is the same as for other people. You cannot, you listen to your body when you exercise, you gradually build up. Now, the second question really addresses the first. It's, can you over-exercise? And that's a very good question. And the reason why is the literature for years said that you can damage yourself by over-exercising. Now, we have published a number of studies on this, as have others, and there's no evidence that you can exercise you can damage or make your CMT worse by over-exercising. But that doesn't mean you won't make an individual joint worse. So, we've all been there where you've hurt a knee or something, you decide to ignore it and continue walking or continue doing whatever you're doing, and it hurts more. And that's just logical. So clearly, if you do something and it hurts, you can make it worse. But that doesn't apply to anyone with CMT than anything else. But you don't make your condition worse by over-exercising. So that's not an excuse not to exercise because you don't make your condition worse. You just have to be careful. I would say if someone has quite bad foot involvement, having to wear orthosis, and they tell me they're not, I can remember a boy that came to my clinic and he was a teenager and he went to university and he used to do gymnastics. And he was very good at gymnastics, but as he had CMT X1, so he had the X type of CMT, and as he hit his late teens, with the gymnastics he was doing, he was constantly turning on his feet. As you can imagine, he was doing complex jumps, landing on his feet, and it just was not the right exercise. So we had a long chat. And then he came to my clinic the following year and he'd taken up breakdancing. Breakdancing was not much better. So, it's all to do with what is good for your feet and stability. I mean, he eventually did something more sensible, but, he had to learn that himself as well as a teenager. So I think it depends on the stage you're in. Over-exercising is not a problem, and it's listening to your body. I do think, and there's an increasing use of personal trainers for CMT, and we're beginning to, I know our consultant physiotherapist here, Geeta Ramadari, is now being allowed to write through GPs for exercise prescriptions. So it used to be that was just for people with diabetes and high blood pressure, but I think there is a move towards, at least a tendency for GPs to be allowed to write exercise prescriptions for someone with CMT to have a personal trainer. And some of the personal trainers have been thought to be very good with patients with CMT. And I think some patients have done really well when they've got that. Now, I bet people will write in and say, an email in and say, this is not available in my area. I'm sure it's not universally available. But to me, that is an absolute aim we should be getting at, that people will have a personalized training regime done as they grow, that they can do for themselves. And I think that's very important. And to be a very forward vision use of resources for the health system as well to prevent problems later on.
Yeah. Well, for many people, it would be helpful, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. We could all do a bit of that, but still.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, the next question I have is regarding B12 injections, and it comes from Alan Ralph, who's asking the relationship really between B12 injections and CMT.
Sorry about that. Sorry, I thought I had turned it off. So that's a good question. I would like to address that question. So first of all, I'm just reading the question here that is to that vitamin T is disconnected. Okay. So basically, there is no direct relationship between B12 deficiency, therefore needing B12 injections in CMT. So B12 deficiency does not cause CMT. That's the first thing to say. But the second thing to say is B12 deficiency does cause a neuropathy. So if you become deficient in B12, you will eventually get a neuropathy, and it can be a very difficult neuropathy. And for other reasons, not due to CMT, we see a lot of B12 deficiency at the moment to do with something young people do, which we won't go into. So we do see a lot of B12 deficiency at the moment, and it is a real problem because it can cause a neuropathy, and quite a significant neuropathy. So we would say that someone with CMT, people need to be really careful that they don't develop other causes of neuropathy, such as B12 deficiency. And, as you get older, you don't always absorb B12 as well as you used to absorb it. So certainly it's something that I check in all my patients with CMT when they come to me for the first time, particularly more older patients, just to be sure that their B12 is optimum. Now, there's a bit of a problem with B12. So B12 we mainly get from meat, not exclusively, but mainly. So it is more of a problem in vegetarians and vegans. Now, it's not that you cannot find B12 in other sources, you can, but people that grew up in communities that were vegetarian and vegan tend to be very good at getting other sources of all kinds of nutrients. But I find in my own practice that people that become vegetarian and vegan, that used to be vegetarian and vegan, are not always as good at knowing the nutrients they need. So we do see B12 deficiency in patients with CMT who have become vegetarian and vegan, not infrequently. And then it is important that it is treated. Sometimes you need injections, sometimes tablets will do. But we actually only retain about 3 months supply of B12. So it is one of these things. And there's a little bit of B12 in beer, not a huge amount. And I had a patient who hadn't CMT, but became a vegan. And for 7 years, he was fine. And then he got a neuropathy. And the only thing he'd done in the 3 months before seeing me was give up beer. Because it was just enough, obviously, to keep him just about there. So, it is yeast in beer that has some B12 as well. So it's not saying you should drink beer. That is not what I'm saying. But I'm saying there isn't, B12 does not cause CMT, but it's like getting an MOT in a car. It is one of the things that can cause a neuropathy and therefore make your neuropathy worse. So it is something, particularly for vegetarians and vegans, to keep a very careful eye on if it becomes an issue. But the vast majority of people with CMT do not need B12 injections. And certainly if your B12 is normal, there's no need to have B12 injections. You get plenty from your diet.
Okay, so generally there's plenty in your diet, but if you have a big change in your diet, then you need to look at
yes, and also the other thing is if you have bowel surgery, you absorb it through your bowel. So if you have bowel surgery, absolutely, or tummy surgery of any type, people need to think of B12. That's very important if somebody has had some of their bowel or tummy removed.
Oh, okay, thank you. I've got probably the penultimate question, I think, from Ian Godfrey, who had optic atrophy and let me see if I can get this right.
Nystagmus, yeah.
Nystagmus?
Yeah. So basically, that's their conditions of the eye. So optic atrophy is when the nerve to the eye for vision becomes pale. That's the word atrophy. and usually it's associated with a reduction initially in seeing colors, and it can cause a reduction in your vision. Nystagmus is a problem where the eyes move in a jerky fashion when they're looking from right to left.
Okay.
Now, in straightforward CMT, nystagmus is not usually seen in CMT. Optic atrophy is the myelin, the nerve that supplies the vision is what we call a central nerve, a nerve from the brain, rather than a nerve. It's unlike the nerves in the arm and legs. So the vast majority of people with CMT do not get a problem with their vision because it's a different set of nerves. There are a few exceptions, and the commonest exception is a type of CMT called CMTUK due to mutations in a gene called mitofusion 2, which is a mitochondrial gene, and those patients can get a neuropathy and can get optic atrophy. And there's one or two other rare forms of CMT. So in some rare forms of CMT, we do see optic atrophy, and immediately we see it, it would make us look for a certain set of genes. So yes, you can see it. It's rare, but it means there's certain genes involved.
Okay, and that kind of leads quite nicely onto the next question, which is about different types of CMT. I had a particular question about finding information about 2F, but I'm sure there's many other types that people would like to find information on. And I know CMT UK, we try and get as much information as we can out there and on our website. But can you guide people to where they might find?
I think CMT UK is very good. And the other thing is we do have, and I don't know if you have a link to this in your website, Simon, we do have the Inherited Neuropathy Consortium, which is NIH, that's the National Institute of Health in the US, funded international consortium, the research of CMT. And as part of that, we've developed a website for patients. And Steve Scher is one of the consultants in Philadelphia that keeps this up to date with all of our help. So what it does do is divide it by type. So it's a very detailed information source. So we can certainly send the link to that to have at CMT UK for a more detailed link to different types of CMT, because individual CMTs are there's so many different ones now that people find that one. The one you mentioned, CMT2F, is due to mutation in a gene called HSPB1. And that kind of CMT, it usually causes what's called a motor predominant CMT. Average age of onset has been between the 20s and the 50s. And it usually causes an unusual problem that you have weakness of your ankle, foot drop, but also getting up on your toes. So you have weakness going up on your toes and your ankles, which means if you try to stand still, it can feel very unstable. You're better at walking than standing still. So it tends to affect and then affects the top of the leg. So it's a slightly different pattern as a weakness and much, much less sensory involvement. So when we see patients with that type of CMT, we have a slightly different approach to the orthosis. And we know what's going to happen over the next 10, 20 years will affect different muscles. So it is correct that different forms of CMT, once we know about them, we know more about how they'll present. The other thing, there was just one question I think we missed from a Fiona Livingston, I think, just notice there was about her dad with CMT, and I think type 1, she mentioned that these headaches, earaches, and explosion type noises and various other pains. I mean, that would not be to do with CMT. I just thought I would say, because I see that one there, you know, with CMT, you don't get pains in your ears or headaches normally, because this is not a major problem, unless people were having sleep apnea where they were not sleeping properly. And if you have sleep apnea, you can sometimes wake with headaches in the morning and be sleepy during the day. And sleep apnea means you don't sleep during the night, you don't get enough oxygen in your sleeping. But that's a rare cause of it. But you know, if someone is having headaches with CMT, it is something that doctors will sometimes look into. But most causes of headaches and earaches are not due to CMT. Just to reassure Fiona Livingston.
Thank you. Thank you for being on the ball and catching that one. That's good. And if you could let us have that link, I can make sure it goes up on our website. But thank you so much for this session, for answering these questions. It's been brilliant as always. Thank you to everybody from the CMT community who sent in questions, and everybody who's watching this this video or this session. If you want to find out more about CMT and about CMT UK, do visit our website, cmt.org.uk. And together we can help increase the awareness of CMT. Please feel free to share this when it goes up on YouTube or other platforms, and any of our other posts, especially during our CMT Awareness Month. Thank you. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you.